As Bolger began wrestling with this new way of doing politics, he began asking New Zealanders to wrestle with some much older issues. Honouring the Treaty of Waitangi, previously a catch cry of the left, became perhaps the defining legacy of his time in power as he took his party in a new direction on race relations.
I don't know where you put the starting point of me looking seriously at what we hadn't done in New Zealand. And I often use the starting point of the early Waitangi Day celebrations that we used to attend as members of Parliament. And in the early days, the slogans were, "The treaty is a fraud." And on reflection, of course, they were absolutely right, because what the treaty promised hadn't been delivered. To that extent, it was a fraud. And then it moved and shifted to honour the treaty, which is really where I think you could say the work that I and others have done has moved to take New Zealand with us, to honour the treaty, the commitments that were entered into it. And what we're really talking about is New Zealand's honour. I mean, people try to get the word, and will they mean a bit of this and mean a bit of that? But there's no question what the intent was, that there should be a respect and understanding and acknowledgement that Maori were here first, that they own the assets of the land, and so on. I mean, this is not in dispute by any half-reputable scholar. So we then had to move from that point to what do you do about it?
Bolger's first step was the Sealord Deal in 1992, a political opening too good to miss.
First was a bit opportunistic. We were settling the ocean fisheries, and there was a sale coming up of about 20% of the total quota, which was my judgment and estimation about what should be allocated to Maori. And so I was Prime Minister, I invited in 3 of the senior Maori leaders to my office, and through a long evening session into the night. Doug Graham came in from time to time, Doug Kidd, who was Minister of Fisheries, came in from time to time, but essentially it was me and the 3 leaders, and we reached the bare bones of the agreement that this is what we would do. And
over the night?
Yes.
Years of debate about how Māori would divide the quota followed. Yet if anything, efforts to settle compensation for land confiscations or raipatu created more political risk. In 1994, Bolger tried to cap the cost of settling grievances in what became known as the fiscal envelope.
We started then with Tainui. Let me take you back one step, because we're having discussions in government how much this should cost. Treasury and then Minister thought very little. And at one cabinet committee meeting where this was being discussed, Doug was clearly distressed at how little was being suggested. And he turned to me and said words to the effect, "Well, what are you going to do, Jim?" And I said, "Well, I'm not walking away. I have no intention of walking away. And I don't know what is the right amount, but I suggest we should start thinking of $1 billion, and then we can start talking to the big claimants and start to work things out."
And just to put that in context, the reading I've done suggests that Ruth Richardson started at 0 and moved to 400 million. Is that the sort of context that you remember?
The 400 sound about right. I doubt if 0 is right, but I mean, I'm not sure it was as high as 400 million, to be honest.
In other words, very little compared to...
Relative to the need.
Despite heated hui and fierce protests, negotiations continued, and in 1995, Tainui settled with the Crown for $170 million and a formal apology for the invasion of the Waikato. That broke the logjam, and Ngāi Tahu followed suit the next year. But as the 1996 election approached, unease within party ranks was growing.
When we started to make progress in the settlement of Ngāi Tahu, we were getting closer to the 96 election, and the members of the party in the South Island, including members of Parliament and senior people in the party, got terribly nervous about settling before the election. This would cost us all sorts of votes, etc.
They threatened you, didn't they? They wrote to you and...
Well, they wrote me a long letter, but I've had lots of long letters. Long letters are not
essentially
material.
Saying what? You'll lose thousands of votes?
Well, yes, they said we'd lose seats and votes and all the rest of it, and I told them that we wouldn't. And this is where uncertainty plays a debilitating effect on people's thinking, because they were uncertain what the outcome was. I was totally certain what the outcome was. Maori were going to continue to live as they are till they got the settlement done properly, and then they'd move forward.
Did that opposition extend to your own ministers? Did you have to?
Oh yes, of course I had ministers who were totally dubious about Bolger's settling these treaty claims. And but I never had any doubts that we had to do it. The fact that some found that disquieting, unsettling, was of, in all honesty, little consequence. There was a much bigger goal we had to achieve, and that was to bring honour back to the Crown, to New Zealand, that we would in fact carry through and do what we said we'd do all those years ago when the treaty was signed.
Will these stand the test of time, or do we face the prospect of future generations saying, well, look, we didn't get enough?
Entirely up to us. The question's legitimate, that if Maori still make up the great percentage of the bottom 20 or 25% in New Zealand, then you can expect someone to ask the question again, because it means that society has failed.
You have a strong belief too about the power of language.
Yes.
And the value of te reo Māori being taught in schools.
I said every child should be taught Maori in primary school. I still believe that. Half the countries of the world that we consider to be developing, underdeveloped, impoverished nations, their youngsters are speaking 3 languages. We have convinced ourselves as a society that to teach everybody Maori would be a terrible burden on society. Nonsense, absolute nonsense.
I wondered what your thoughts were when you listened to the Orewa speech and looked at the fallout from another National Party leader, Don Brash, at that time, and was met politically with huge reward for expressing his views at that point. What did you think when you saw that?
I disagreed with it. I mean, but you could go right up to date and look at Donald Trump. He just won the election in the United States by victimising the poor, whether they're Muslim poor or Hispanic poor. That's in essence what he's done. And I just think that's a terrible, terrible way to try and run a country.
And you saw the Orewa speech in that frame?
Oh, it wasn't anywhere near as bad as Trump. But it was in that frame. It is again, and the same gentleman was in the same space again, talking about Hobson's promise or something. I mean, as if somehow or other when Hobson said, when he shook hands with the Maori chiefs when they signed the treaty, we are now one people. Iwi tahi tatoa, we are now one people. As if that answered everything. So we now have a right to steal all your land and your property and your goods. I mean, how absurd can you get? But some people follow absurdities.
How do you feel about the track and progress of the Māori-Pākehā relationship now?
I think we are in much better shape, but we shouldn't be complacent. There are still those who can't see any need for it, and I just mentioned one of them. I mean, there are still those who, for reasons that are beyond my comprehension, are fearful that if Maori do well, somehow or other the rest of us will do poorly. It's absolutely the reverse.
And you've talked a lot about knowing who we are. I wonder whether that was the driving force behind you wanting to set up Te Papa.
Without question. So here we were with no money, and we had inherited the concept, or the draft of a concept from the outgoing government of building a new national museum. Obviously, Treasury and those of that ilk said, well, we can't afford it. And that very moment we couldn't. But my argument was quite different. We needed a museum that captured who we were as a people, as a nation, as a country, and we needed to keep moving forward with this project. We didn't have to spend much money at the beginning, and by the time we had to spend real money, we'd have the economy fixed. Well, that was hard for the hardline smart people to ignore that observation.
You didn't have a lot of support for this move, did you?
Oh, I had virtually none. But early in your time as Prime Minister, after you just won a massive election, you have sort of additional authority. So with about 4 or 5 on site and most of them confused or opposed, I declared we'd move forward. That seemed to be about a majority to me at that stage, and that's why we have Te Papa today.
That quest for national identity was underpinned by Bolger's firm commitment to republicanism, including our own Supreme Court and honours system. He didn't have the numbers in his time, but laid the ground for those reforms under Helen Clark.
I think you have to be brave enough to let go of some things going forward. Every child has to let go of their parent at some stage, in the sense they were totally dependent on when they're very small, less dependent as they go through life, and then they have to go and make their own way in the world.
But what stage are we in the evolution?
Well, I think we're 90% there, but we still have those who like to hang on to some of the trappings. And some people love knighthoods and damehoods and so forth and so on. I declined one, of course, and because I don't identify myself. I don't need that to identify myself. I wasn't interested in people having to call me sir.
Why not?
Because it didn't fit in with my view of the world. It's an archaic term from a distant past. We have to sometime give up the colonial mentality.
And to you, that extends to republicanism.
Of course. You're sitting down with a square sheet of paper and somebody said, draw up a constitutional political framework for New Zealand, and you'll say, we've got it all worked out. Everything will happen here in New Zealand, in the islands of Aotearoa, New Zealand, but except the head of state will put it as far away as possible. And you'd say, well, why do that? So again, we inherited it. And that's not being critical in any shape or form of Her Majesty the Queen, who I think is an extraordinary person, quite extraordinary person. And I have had the great privilege of meeting her many times. But the structure is no longer fit for purpose.
While Bolger was a committed friend to New Zealand's traditional allies as Prime Minister, in the mid-1990s he made the then bold claim that New Zealand was part of Asia. It caused an uproar.
And I answered a question at a big conference of 1,000 economists in Hong Kong. And I was talking about New Zealand's engagement with Asia. And I said that New Zealand was obviously now more focused on Asia, the opportunities, the possibilities, our relationship with Asia. And someone said to me, how can you? This is from the back of the hall, a question. You're so far away. And I said, no. From our perspective, we are close to Asia. We see ourselves as part of Asia. Well, needless to say, that was covered. And I had all sorts of people offering to send me a map so that I could see in the world where New Zealand was. But
it was controversial at the time, wasn't it?
It was very controversial. But you see, again, leaders are only of value if they see a little further with the knowledge they have than others might see. That's the purpose of leadership. There's no use saying, come follow me, if you don't know where you're going. And a leader has an obligation to know where they're going.
Do we miss that a little now, where we seem to be driven by what the polling groups are going to say and how this is going to reflect politically?
Well, I think polls are a distraction. They're inevitable, but they're a distraction. I firmly believe that if you are careful and you have worked on the issues and feel confident in your knowledge of the issues, going out in front and saying, come follow me on this or that particular issue is not a dangerous position to be in. Yes, you could say that I lost my prime ministership because various people thought I was moving too far in front. Maybe I was. But I don't regret for a moment that I kept moving in front, because from my perspective, that's the role of a leader.